Dungeons and Dragons has an undeniable relationship with wargaming. Gary Gygax's representation of what D&D was changed during the game's first few years. The historical evidence shows a fairly clear progression. D&D begins inside the wargaming hobby and is explicitly presented as a fantastical medieval wargame campaign. Okay. Now I'm starting out like this right away, as you know, because that statement alone does not support my take on this. I'm making sure that statement is out front right away, just to show that I will put truth and facts above my own personal opinion. That's just a starting point there. Okay, then role-playing games become recognized as a separate category of game. And by 1978, Gary Gygax himself describes paper and pencil fantasy role-playing game as a distinct game concept, alongside but separate from miniature and board wargames. 1974, D&D is presented as wargaming. The clearest evidence is printed directly on the original Dungeons and Dragons. The subtitle of the 1974 game was Rules for a Fantastic Medieval Wargames Campaign, playable with paper and pencil and miniature figures. That wording is preserved in the archives, in the records for the original game at the Strong National Museum of Play. There is nothing ambiguous about the terminology being used. The product describes itself as rules for fantastic medieval war games campaigns. This was not a description imposed upon D&D decades later. It was how Gary Gygax, Dave Arneson, and Tactical Studies Rules presented the game when it was published. TSR, Tactical Studies Rules. This is me being as fact-based as you possibly could ever get. Every guy who disagrees with me right now about D&D being a war game, they love this. If this wasn't members only, oh, I know some guys would be really happy to hear me making these statements. But it is what it is, baby. D&D came directly out of the wargaming hobby. The terminology makes sense because D&D's immediate history was deeply rooted in wargaming. Gary Gygax was a wargamer. Dave Arneson was a wargamer. The communities in which D&D developed were heavily connected with wargaming, and one of D&D's immediate predecessors was chainmail. Chainmail was a medieval miniatures wargaming system by Gary Gygax and Jeff Herron. Its fantasy supplement expanded medieval miniature warfare to include things such as wizards, heroes, superheroes, dragons, fantastic creatures, and magical effects. Dave Arneson's Blackmore campaign took ideas originating in this game's environment and pushed play increasingly towards individual characters and adventures. Gygax developed the rules that became Dungeons and Dragons, so historical ancestry is wargaming, medieval miniature wargaming, chainmail, chainmail fantasy supplement, Blackmore and related experimentation, and then Dungeons and Dragons. D&D did not emerge immediately of wargaming. It emerged from inside of it. 1974 to 1975. The wargaming description continues. The original game's description was not an isolated occurrence. The early OD&D supplements continue using language of additional rules for fantastic medieval war games campaigns. So through the earliest period of OD&D, TSR continued formally presenting D&D using vocabulary of wargaming. The distinction is not that D&D had nothing unusual about it. Clearly it did. Players increasingly controlled individual characters rather than armies. Adventures could continue indefinitely. Campaigns could involve dungeon exploration, wilderness exploration, and character advancement. But the terminology TSR initially used to describe this new form of game still came from the hobby that had produced it, wargaming. 1976, TSR began explicitly separating the categories. Only 2 years after D&D's publication, something significant happens. The final issue of the Strategic Review, published in April 1976, announced that TSR was replacing the magazine with something new: periodicals. TSR explained that one magazine would be devoted to S&S, fantasy, sci-fi, and role-playing games, while the others would deal with the established types and periods of wargaming. Those magazines became The Dragon and Little Wars. The Dragon would concentrate upon fantasy, science fiction, sword and sorcery, and role-playing games. Little Wars would serve the traditional wargaming audience. So you're at the stage of now there's a hint of separation. This is where I would say is they start realizing it isn't the thing. So it's you're trying to figure out what this is, and Gary and his team are starting to see it as something completely different. But that means if they're learning this, that means it's been different the entire time. It doesn't matter how they present it at first. They're presenting something they don't understand they have. So this again starts leaning towards where I say it's not wargaming. But anyway, let's skip back to this. Little Wars, as I said, would serve the traditional wargaming audience. The wording matters because TSR is now explicitly using two different categories: role-playing games and wargaming. This statement appeared in the Strategic Review under editor Tim Kask, so it represents TSR's published position rather than a statement that should be personally attributed to Gary Gygax. Contemporary cataloging also identifies Kask in the Cauldron as the editorial announcing the end of the Strategic Review. So it's Tim Kask, but understand it's Tim Kask speaking for the company. That's why you can take what he says in that thing as a representation of Gygax's own new position. Because trust me, Tim Kask wasn't doing anything without Gary knowing about it. So you can't say it's Gary saying it, but you can't say it's Gary. There be any denial. You'd have to just say Gary would agree with this. 1976. The hobby is splitting. The creation of two magazines physically demonstrates the distinction. The old publication had attempted to cover both sides of TSR's audience. Now TSR created The Dragon, fantasy and role-playing, and Little Wars, established wargaming. There was still overlap. The Dragon could discuss miniatures and board games, while Little Wars wasn't restricted exclusively to miniatures, but the categories themselves had separated D&D. D&D had originated within the wargaming community. Now the role-playing game, or the role-playing audience, was large and distinct enough to receive its own publication. So you start because you're trying to sell this game to an already built-in audience. But why would they separate? Here's another big reason. The wargaming community doesn't actually cross over en masse to D&D. I've said this a million times. But the reason there's a separation is the majority of the customers that came to D&D were not wargamers. And so now they're so not wargamers doing something that is not directly wargaming, that there's no point in keep calling it wargaming to an audience that doesn't even relate with what you're talking about. Just saying. 1977, Gygax explains D&D's wargaming ancestry. Gary Gygax did not subsequently did not deny where D&D came from. Blah. Quite the opposite. In his writings about D&D's origins, he traced the game's development through the wargaming community, medieval campaigns, chainmail, Dave Arnes's Blackmore experiments, and eventually Dungeons and Dragons. The relationship can therefore be described as an evolution rather than a rejection. D&D had developed from wargaming. That does not require D&D to remain classified as a wargame forever. It can become something different from its ancestor. Again, they're learning what it is. So my argument is, even if they figure out it's not a war game later, what that's still saying is it was never a war game to begin with. But they just don't know this. That's how early in life this was for this hobby and for this game. It's hard for people to now look back and think it that way, but you got to think that as much as we know now, this was so new that there wasn't a lot of these assumed thoughts or lingo or assumptions or anything existing in the minds of the people making this stuff. 1978, Gygax calls the RPG a new game concept. The clearest evidence for Gygax's later position appears in Dragon 16. Published in July 1978, Gary Gygax wrote, "The position of originating the concept of a paper and pencil fantasy role-playing game stood greatly to TSR's credit." So he is now fully on board with saying this is a fantasy role-playing game. Pen and paper fantasy role-playing game. Says it in his own words. No longer using the language of wargaming, completely separating it from wargaming. In his words, it placed TSR beside the creators of chess, miniature war games, and board war games. That creates a remarkably clear set of categories. Gygax identifies chess, miniature war games, board games, and paper and pencil fantasy role-playing games as being separate. The fantasy role-playing game is being presented as a game concept in its own right. Gygax isn't claiming TSR merely created a new variety of miniature war game. He says TSR originated the concept of paper and pencil fantasy role-playing games and compares that accomplishment with the creation of other forms of gaming. So he's saying clearly, we have made something that is not like it is its own separate thing. It is not wargaming. And what that would mean is no matter what they were saying when they were trying to figure this out, what he's saying is overall, from the get-go until now, what we created is not wargaming. And he's separating D&D from wargaming and not identifying it as Dungeons and Dragons is wargaming.